Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined by Josh Blank, Research Director for the Texas Politics Project. Good morning, Josh.
Good morning to you. Happy summer.
Well, it's been a long travail, a lot of interesting revelations, and now the jury has spoken.
Yes.
And no, we're not talking about Donald Trump. We're talking about Dade Phelan. So as we meet today to record this podcast, it's Wednesday morning after the Tuesday election runoff. So we've been on hiatus for a couple of weeks to wrap up the semester, but we're now back on the day after the long-awaited runoffs.
It's been a very long wait.
Yeah, I mean, I could have put four O's in that, and it still wouldn't have quite captured how long it feels like this primary election has been going on.
And I want the viewers to know there actually are 3 O's in the notes in long.
Right, and it doesn't even begin to cover it.
I normally edit these things, but I knew it was on purpose.
So let's just look at the results. We'll just jump right in. So front and center for the audience of this podcast and the Text Ledge crowd, current Speaker Dade Phelan wins a squeaker over David Covey by 366 votes, last I saw, out of a total of 26-60. Phelan won big in his home county of Jefferson, which is, by the conventional wisdom, was the only way he was going to pull this out. Covey wins in much smaller Jasper, and Covey edges Phelan by a little more than 800 votes in Orange County. And while I know that we'll see what the Phelan debrief is on this and what people say about the technical aspects. The Orange County difference, I think, was a big difference in that Covey beat Phelan by about 2,300 votes there in the first round in March. And he edged Phelan by about 800. Now we expect the turnout on these things to be lower, but in a lot of these in a lot of these counties, particularly in Jasper, in all of them, but particularly in Jasper, the vote was and in Jefferson, the vote was pretty close to what we saw. The turnout was pretty close in those counties to what we saw in the first round, but was somewhat lower in Orange, I believe.
Right. I mean, just, with the major caveat that when you're talking about such a small electorate and such a small number of voters, you don't want to go, you don't want to overemphasize anything. But certainly you're right. In the postmortems, it's going to be interesting to see sort of what the description of it is, either of how one camp, how either Phelan succeeded or how Covey failed there. And I'm just, I guess we'll have to wait and see what the local reporting looks like.
Well, and there will also be, that will not ever be settled in the sense that,
Well, yeah.
People still have very strongly held opinions about what happened in the O'Rourke Cruz race in 2018, and people, have not given up on that explanation.
Well, or like our friend, Sasha Eisenberg, who was on this podcast years and years and years ago, wrote about it in the Victory Lap, made a good point. He's like, a lot of people don't stick around once they lose. In terms of, there's not a lot of people on the campaign shops being like, well, let's look at why this didn't go our way.
It's like a close look about one of the worst days of my life.
Better. Yeah, exactly.
So we'll talk about it. I mean, in absolute terms, certainly a good night for Dade Phelan. Within Team Phelan, otherwise not such a great night.
No.
So not surprisingly, given the precedents that we knew, and there was, tons of the usual suspects talked about, the various permutations of being an incumbent in a runoff and what your odds were. Generally, they're not good.
Yeah, right.
And last night underlined that.
I was going to say.
So we had a lot of losing incumbents.
Yeah, so out of 9 incumbents who were up for re-election, 7 were defeated, including 6 Republican incumbents and 1 Democratic incumbent. So not a good night for incumbents and runoffs. But as you're pointing, I mean, I would say this to a lot of people kind of heading into this. It's like, a majority of the district already voted for a majority of the primary voters who showed up, let me say it that way, already voted for somebody else.
Yeah, in most circumstances.
So you have to, well, in all circumstances, right? So you have to overcome the fact that, because even if you're multi-candidate.
On these races, yeah. In some of these races, there were some people barely avoided the runoff, right?
Yeah, but even so, that means that 51% voted for at least two other candidates. So you're just starting behind the eight ball in these things. So it's not surprising to see, a bad night for a lot of these incumbents. I mean, I think what's surprising in some ways is the fact that any of them escaped.
Yeah. So what do we see? So Justin Holland lost to Katrina Pearson,
right?
One of my sub themes in my head for this, with Shelley Luther and Katrina Pearson both likely to be House members. This is the revenge of the Tea Party. John Kemple lost to Alan Schoolcraft. Dwayne Burns lost to Helen Kerwin. Frederick Frazier lost to Carissa Richardson. Lynn Stuckey lost to Andy Hopper. Stephanie Click lost to David Lowy. And Sean Theory lost to Lauren Simmons, and that was the Democratic loss that you were referring to. The incumbent survivors in HD1, Gary Van Dever lives to fight another day.
Yep.
In his very characteristic low-key style. And then, of course, Phelan won. So, you look back overall, you look, so, where do we want to go? So let's talk a little bit. I mean, so one of the key subtext here, of course, is this notion that, which I'm largely correct, that a big part of this was motivated by, two big factors, at least in terms of the counter mobilization against incumbents. One, vouchers / school choice. Two, Ken Paxton's impeachment, at least in the House.
Yeah.
Now, I think those are the initial factors. We can dig deeper and be a little more structural.
Those are motivating factors, maybe,
right,
if not
right, yeah,
actual,
that's what the instigated.
Where we like to be specific, as opposed to maybe determinants.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, as has been pointed out widely on this podcast, and some of the newsletters, the more institutional newsletters this morning. While vouchers were a big instigating factor here,
right.
One can argue, I think, with a lot of evidence, although I haven't seen any systematic evidence of this, but I'm not overly skeptical. I mean, I think this sounds about right, and I think if we had systematic evidence, it would confirm this. Even though vouchers were the kind of the burr under the saddle, they weren't whipping the horse with vouchers; they were whipping the horse with border security in terms of what happened in the campaign. But whatever that, if you look at the 21 Republican no votes on vouchers, and we now look at what the outcome of the primary was, 7 won their primaries, 9 were defeated, and 5 retired. And of those seats that were vacated by the retirements, 4 of the 5 were replaced by pro-voucher votes, which is why, this was, at least in the short term, this was a good night for Greg Abbott, a good night for Dan Patrick. In terms of the politics of that issue, but the way that issue has become, I think, and this is the more digging under part, I think, there's the degree to which this primary and the voucher issue, but especially the primary, became a real exercise in the power of the statewide leadership, in particular Patrick and Abbott, with a strong assist from Donald Trump, which we'll get to, versus the members against the bodies.
Yeah.
In that sense. I mean, the degree to which Abbott was willing to challenge House incumbents, challenge precedent and custom, and get deeply involved in these races against so many incumbents, and the degree to which Lieutenant Governor Patrick was, also involved. He was involved in, I think, a slightly more measured way than the governor, at least in its public-facing manifestation. But nonetheless, if we look at some of the systemic factors, and I don't want to jump too quickly to the takeaways, but as we look at episodes of how the power of elected officials in the executive branch vis-a-vis the legislative branch, and of course, Patrick is ultimately kind of more legislative than executive, although he's a statewide elected executive. This is a result that, however much we can be myopic in the short term, to the extent that things, have the potential to establish precedents, we could look back on this as a watershed primary. We may not, people may recede.
Yeah.
But I think it's an open question. But in the short term, the governor comes out of this, however much ill will he may have generated in the body, which is what the insiders, really like to emphasize, is that, well, Abbott is breaking precedent and the members all resent it. And, the upshot, when you look at it with other things Abbott has done to strengthen his position, the position of the governor's office, the position of the executive branch, one aspect of this story falls into that, right?
Yeah.
To my mind.
No, I mean, so I'm listening to you and I agree, right? In the sense that, Abbott laid down, look, Abbott has followed through on his threat, and that's really important. We talk all the time in here sort of, I'm not a big fan of game theory per se, and that's just because I study behavior and attitudes and things like that. And, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But game theory is pretty useful when you're talking about like institutional settings, when you're talking about settings that have a lot of rules, when you're talking about conflicts that are going to have repetition to them. And Abbott has shown through this, through to today, essentially, that, if he makes a threat, it's a credible threat.
Yeah.
He can credibly threaten to end your legislative career if there's an issue that he cares about that you're at odds with him on. And that's a demonstration. So I think in that sense, there's no doubt that he's stronger. I think he's also become, there's a little bit of addition by subtraction here, to the extent that the House is a little bit more unruly. That gives more power probably to, it gives more power to the executive generally. I mean, Patrick, again, is in both camps in a way. It also gives Abbott, I think, again, more power. Again, we're going to, we'll come to this, the impact on the speaker's race and all that kind of stuff. But odds are Abbott's going to be, in a stronger position potentially. I think so. I think there's reasons that you can kind of debate it, but vis-a-vis the legislature. At the same time, there's a sort of like the battle versus the war kind of analogy, right? I mean, he's definitely won this battle, and it definitely is going to have, some kind of desired consequence. I think one thing we may or may not get to in this discussion is, sort of the handicapping on vouchers at this point.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there is a little bit to all this, which is sort of, and I can't help but like dovetail it with the GOP convention that took place last week, right?
Yeah.
And to say, there's a little bit of the way that this is played out where, and you think about the power dynamics here, and you say, yeah, Abbott got stronger, but so too did the far right of the party, the dissident wing. And, to your point of, what kind of precedent does this establish? Well, you think about what happened at the GOP convention where, Rinaldi's and Paxton's, handpicked successor was chosen to lead the party. He's expected to kind of continue in the style of Rinaldi, which I will, describe as, I'll just, for the purposes of this discussion, I'll describe as, having the party organization act more as a purity maintaining group, maybe necessarily than a fundamental support organization, right? Yeah. And that's been sort of the discussion that's been going on, in the last week or so about
I think the way I've described that is that, the machinery of the party, the Republican Party in the state per se, has become really an agent of a faction.
Right. And so, and that's important in a very technical sense, but it also becomes a meaningful sense in that, basically once the party censures somebody, they can essentially start spending money against them. They can endorse against them. And, not to make too much of the Republican Party platform. They always are what they are. Maybe this one's more conservative than the last one, but they're all very, extreme documents in most cases with lots of things one can pick and choose out. But at this point, the party has exhibited a willingness to punish members of the party, elected officials, basically selectively if they decide not to stick to any one of these potential, party positions, which are not really broad party positions. So in some ways, I'm kind of coming out of this to say, yeah, Abbott's stronger, but in the process of this, because the enemy, whatever is the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. All of a sudden, the same people who were essentially going after Abbott, in his last legislative primary to try to knock him off, he's actually done the most to help them that I think has happened in the last decade probably, and probably put them in the strongest position vis-a-vis, again, the legislative body. You see what's going on with the party. They also have a really firm hold of the party organization now in a way that it seems to me it's hard to imagine this pattern. As you said, we set something up. Is it precedent? Is it an aberration? But it's hard to imagine the way these other things have played out, that you're not going to see more retribution politics going forward in Republican primaries unless everybody just toes the line on everything.
Right, which is unlikely. But I mean, I think, look, that's a good area for takeaways and or
I couldn't help. I'm sorry, I couldn't help it.
I mean, which is, what and how much can we learn about the current state of the Republican Party, which is going to be a big part of the discussion today. And, I think if you look at a lot of the public opinion data that we've talked about in here, and you look at the distribution of not just, I want to say attitudes, but also sensibilities among Republican voters.
Yeah.
And these divisions that we've seen, one of the things, I was looking at some of this last night. We've talked about it in here a lot. The idea that, pretty consistently you've got about a third of Republicans who say that the party is still not conservative, that the elected officials
in Texas,
the Republican elected officials are not conservative enough.
Right.
And I think what we saw last night is the ability of that, the elite and operational, those that are along the elites and the operatives within the party universe, not just the party, but also the consultant class, et cetera, the donors, to use that base of the electorate within the way that the political system works in Texas right now to drive the agenda.
Yeah.
Right. And to drive the agenda through this kind of, transformation to some degree. And we were talking about this beforehand of the party. Now, look, the Republican Party apparatus for a long time has been, the home to, mischief and activism by the most conservative elements of the party.
Right.
I mean, I remember doing a, participant observation trip to the party convention in 2002. And there were people, with no rhino buttons at that convention in 2000. So this has been going on for a while.
Right.
Right. But, there's been an alignment between, and I think this is what's interesting about last night to me, is that there's been an alignment between those forces who have taken over the party apparatus, their well-heeled allies in the donor community.
Yeah.
And the donor community is a
very
stupid term.
Yeah.
Among the donor base, that has gotten much more attention in recent years. And factions within the legislature, they've got enough traction in the party, in the base, and without significant challenge other than some isolated incidents over the last decade in elections to shift the nature of what is going on in the party. I think what's, we used to call, you use the term, and I've used it a lot, but it feels a little like it might be time to retire the term dissident faction.
Yeah. Right.
Right. Because they are, they are a minority within the party. But, I've been reminded a lot, I was thinking about this last night quite a bit, to the argument you and I were making 10 years ago, I guess, about the Tea Party and the nature of support for the Tea Party. And I think this is all very connected to that. That was certainly an important chapter in what we're seeing right now. And that is, it's one thing to say, well, there's really only about a third of Republicans or, whatever you're talking about on a certain issue that embrace these, more extreme positions. Or this more, and I think the better way to put it is
the most extreme policy manifestations of attitudes that are generally shared, though.
Right. Well, that's what I was going to say is that an extreme, basically, and it's not just the point here in a lot of ways is the agenda, right? What is the agenda? What are the 3 or 4 issues that are top, and what is the rationale for that? But we used to talk a lot about how there was a lot of passive support for the Tea Party. And I think what's happened is that the current generation of political entrepreneurs on the far right have finally incorporated that, I think, into their strategy and have leveraged that to become, not so much the dissidents anymore as, the faction that is driving politics and the agenda in the party.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have to think a little bit more about, not wrong terms, but like sort of the push-pull factors between candidates and voters and all that kind of stuff. I will say it is notable, in the sense that, you raise this issue of like, a third of Republican registered voters or so tend to say that Republican elected officials in the state, aren't conservative enough. We've surmised that this group is like probably bigger in the primary electorate, probably bigger still in the runoff electorate. Now, I'm not saying that like that's an easy way to say, well, everybody who voted for, a challenger therefore think they should be more conservative or not. In some ways, that would be a success of the political messaging around a lot of these races. But I think it is really noticeable the consistency of a lot of these results, except for Frederick Frazier, who lost, I think, 68-32. If you look at these, Justin Holland lost 56-44. Kempa lost 55-45. Burns lost 58-42. Stuckey, 58-42. Click 56-44. I mean, so it does kind of say to you, yeah, maybe that is about, what that percentage of the party kind of looks like in a runoff like this, where that kind of message that this incumbent member who, and just to say it, for the 80th probably time, by all accounts, very conservative. Right. Right? Nobody would say this.
I don't think ever, only for campaign purposes did anybody ever look at Stephanie Click and go, oh, flaming liberal.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And yet, this seems to be kind of the pattern that emerged in these, again, about 25,000 people or less, voting in these things. And that's the other, I don't want to go in another direction here, although there's some other takeaways here we might want to talk about. I mean, one of the things I think is interesting is, so what to make of sort of Phelan's victory relative to everybody else's. And in some ways, I think, my this is the morning after. We don't usually do this. This is, my quick hot take. And I've said this before to other people, but like, he's the exception that proves the rule in some ways, which is like, this is not indicative of anything because Phelan, for his own part, probably spent about $333 per vote before you even start calculating anybody else spending anything. So that's for about 12,800 votes, right? So 25,000 total votes. And just, looking at sort of the numbers that came out yesterday, it looked like Phelan and Covey themselves probably spent over, $6 million before you start to even include everybody else who was involved in that race. So for me, as much as, there may be this desire to sort of take that as somehow a signal of whatever. And again, I think and people are going to do this. This is like a special election in Georgia and an off year in, May. It's not meaningful to some sort of direction of state policy what the people in this one district who decided to vote in a runoff, apparently made up of some mixture of Republicans and Democrats, ended up deciding.
Right, yeah. This is where we note that, the lieutenant governor was very quick to message this morning, among others, but the lieutenant governor, the most prominent. Yeah. To, tie as did David Covey, not really, in these times it is very difficult to find graceful losers, let's put it that way. But arguing that there were, some, more than some, four figures, I think 1,700.
That's 1,400, I think.
Yeah, something like, more than 1,000 Democratic voters, voted in this runoff and that they were targeted and, which is now, you mentioned the Republican platform, which dovetails with this discussion now getting more active, interestingly, in the Republican Party saying that they should be closed primaries. We'll see how much, now that this is over, we'll see if that has legs. But.
Yeah, just to put a pin in that for, many months from now, just something to think about, thought exercises, you're a party. Do you think your appeal is increasing or decreasing? You have decisions to make. Do you want to make yourself more closed off or more open? Yeah. I'll just leave that alone to kind of think about, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, I think this is going to be one of those things where the ideological rationale for that, sits oddly with any practical rationale, I would say. But
yeah. Okay.
And I don't think we've seen a lot of this in the past, but we shall see. So we've talked a little bit about what the sort of big structural thing, what this tells us potentially about inter-branch relations, institutional configuration. Hot take on a bit about what's going on in the Republican Party. You mentioned vouchers. Let's talk about this. I mean, this is one of the most common media questions, we're already getting. But, my tone is already saying it. In some ways, it's kind of one of the most least interesting things because I think there's the least uncertainty here, at least to the degree that, I don't think anybody should have any doubt that a voucher bill is coming.
Yeah.
But I didn't have much doubt about that beforehand. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that strikes me about this, I mean, a lot of people have been asking me kind of in the lead up to this, like, oh, well, so if Abbott's successful, how do you handicap vouchers in the next session? And it's kind of like, look, vouchers, like many big issues in the legislature, vouchers have moved a little bit closer each session, and we'd expect next session to move even closer. Is it a fait accompli? Well, I don't know. And part of that is because you've replaced some number of, voucher holdouts in the House doesn't change the fact that there was a lot of disagreement in the House about what the voucher bill ultimately should look like. And there's a lot of disagreement in the House that also would be, contrary to the lieutenant governor's preferences, contrary to the governor's preferences. So I do think something's is likely to get through, but I'm not convinced. And you say like, well, yeah, but surely they're going to do this. Why would they even take a chance? I say, hey, they had 2 special sessions on property tax cuts.
Well, I should say, when I say they're going to do it, I'm not saying.
No, and I'm not saying you're saying that.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to say that you're saying that. I'm just saying that, I said this at the beginning of the last session, and I'll say it again now. Tell me what the legislative vehicle is that satisfies all the coalitions and all the institutional players, and I'm sure it'll pass. Well, I just don't know what that looks like.
Yeah, and I think the particulars of that. I mean, all I would say is, there's going to be a bill. It's going to move. There will be bills moving in both chambers, and we'll see what they look like,
and we'll see
how all that.
Yeah, and if either or both chambers will accept what the other chamber's up to.
And it's a lot like to go to maybe as a transition to another topic or a related topic. It's kind of like judging what the speaker's race may look like.
I love this outcome, by the way, because it's the most chaotic.
We don't know what the electorate is going to be like. Mm-hmm. We don't know what the atmosphere is going to be like. And, people look at me like I'm kind of crazy on this at times. But, I think the outcome of the presidential election is going to weigh into the dynamics of this in an interesting way. I mean, in part because how do the allies of Trump feel? What is the tone? Mm-hmm. Is it anyway, that could affect the atmosphere a lot. And again, I don't want to collapse in self-contradiction here by trying to handicap it too much. Right. But I do think, there's a real temptation in these moments to always say, okay, so this is like, okay, let's start plotting, what the different roads are. And until we see what happens in the general election. And again, at the state level, do we expect there to be huge turnover in the legislature? No, given that there's just not that many competitive seats. But, if we do have some candidates that come out of this that are, in some cases much less experienced and perhaps less rooted in the districts, or they shift.
Less aligned with the districts.
Yeah, or, the center of gravity in the district has shifted, in terms of where this candidate is from and what the mobilization potential is. We don't know what the electorate is going to look like. We don't know what the mood in the House is going to be, but obviously it's going to be interesting. And you and I have talked about this, and some people that saw this may have seen. I did a panel for Pat 2 weeks ago or last week, I guess, and with Mark Jones and Gromer Jeffers Jr. and Harvey Kronberg. And I was in the moderator role. And, I broached the question of, in the scenario that we have, and not that I knew this was going to be the scenario.
Well, you had a good, you're pretty
We were talking
prescient.
About different scenarios, but, in what seemed to me to be the most likely scenario, which is what we've gotten, which is Phelan wins, but very, very narrowly, and this was very, very narrowly. Yeah. How serious, is the challenge? I mean, obviously we knew at the point going in, if he lost, there was going to be another speaker.
Right.
There's one challenger out there and some people stirring around.
Yep.
More various degrees of below or on the radar. Uh-huh. And, in that conversation, I think I was by far the most skeptical that Phelan was obvious that if he survived the race, he would survive as Speaker. Mm-hmm. And now I guess we'll see the test of that.
Yeah.
And I think, so how you handicap that with all the caveats I just introduced about we don't really know. Mm-hmm. I think some of the big questions are, you and I were sort of talking about this a little bit indirectly this morning. Question is, how do his own members feel about him surviving an election where they're about, 15 members of the previous caucus down?
Yeah.
That's hard to calculate. Is he viewed as a embattled veteran survivor? Or is he viewed predominantly as somebody who didn't protect his members and made bad strategic decisions during the last session?
Yeah, and to speak to your point, depending on what the dynamics look like both after the election and what the agenda looks like, he may just look like a really good beat up Shield.
Right.
Which is kind of what he acted. Again, he wasn't a great Shield for those 15 incumbents, but ultimately, if you're looking at everybody else right now, he's taken the most heat and really extracted the most blood to be able to come back. And so, and this is the funny thing about this. I mean, this sort of
sacrificed a lot of soldiers in this battle.
Yeah, and you talk, but it's funny. You talk about we talk about this all the time. At this point, we're going to be stuck on this. We just can't know what's going on behind the scenes. We can't know all the moving and machinations. We can't know how this is going to play out because the membership's not set, the mood's not set. We're not hearing sort of the early agenda talk, all this stuff. Given all that uncertainty, the question becomes, who is the person right now with the highest probability of being Speaker? Just as an academic question standing here.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that person has a 90% chance or an 80%. I'm saying who has the highest percent chance that we can name right now? Like 10%, 20%.
We should open a betting market on this. I guess we probably couldn't do that on a state website.
We can talk. Not on a state website. But if you were to say who has the plurality likelihood of being Speaker, you'd say, well, it's probably the guy who's actually cobbled together a coalition and gotten the votes to be Speaker before. Now, does that mean he's going to be Speaker? It's probably not.
Yeah.
But to say that he's not part of the conversation at this point, and a big part of it is
I would not.
I know you're not saying that. I'm just saying, but to the extent that people feel like, well, he's dead now, he's mortally wounded or whatever. It's he's still a factor in all this until he's not.
Look, there will be a challenge.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right. Whether it's Oliverson, it's usually not the first challenger who declares. So you start, reading tea leaves. Mm-hmm. Right. And there will be, nothing but that and reading tea leaves and gossip. And I've heard and leakage of rumors and, but, one of the things I noticed in I think it was Zach Despart's coverage in the Tribune was who the named members that at least the reporter saw at Phelan's victory party, were Leach, Metcalf, Patterson, Landgraf, and Hefner. Mm-hmm. Where was everyone else? And I'm not saying they needed to be there. A lot of them were in their own districts, had their own, we know where a lot of people that lost were.
Yeah.
But we're going to start watching things like that like crazy, mm-hmm. And there are some senior members out there who have been here a while, who survived various degrees of challenge in the last couple years. A couple in particular who are particularly unhappy with the lieutenant governor and the Senate. And, I can think of at least one or two, and there's no point feeding this now, but that would be, that could have a meeting with the Democrats and make their case.
Yeah.
And do some bargaining. And so, the math on this is going to be interesting. Mm-hmm. And it will be interesting to see how the current Speaker and his team handle this.
Yeah.
We should actually mention a couple things.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, no, I want if we're shifting gears, I would like to.
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to make sure that we mention, that Representative Gonzalez in Congressional District 23.
That's where I was going. That's exactly where I was going.
Held off a pretty, I'll say, significant challenge, I'll put it that way, from Brendan Herrera. Essentially, after, the establishment really came in and backed Gonzalez. He probably had one of the broadest, sort of political coalitions, given how much churn we're seeing in Texas right now. And I think, I've been talking to a lot of people about Congressional District 23. You all probably know about, used to be the swing district in Texas, was made a more Republican district than the last round of redistricting, which means it's about a 55%
Right.
Republican district. And Brendan Herrera, is a YouTube phenomena, if you will,
Yeah.
on the gun right in sort of the gun rights world, which is an odd fit for the district that includes Uvalde. Nonetheless, it was a very close runoff, 52-48 when all was said and done, which I think is
And part of El Paso for that.
part of El
matter.
Paso. Yeah, I was gonna say,
But a close race.
it was a close race, and I'm gonna say this was closer than I kind of thought it was gonna be when all was said and done. Just because Brendan Herrera, if you go look him up, we're not gonna go into it now, but has a very checkered, very
Right.
checkered history on the YouTubes.
And had, people like Matt Gaetz and,
Yeah, he had support from certain
from the dissidents in the U.S. House, shall we say.
some corners.
Who came to support him. Less contentious also, we should mention CD 12 on the Republican side. Former House member Craig Goldman, when he exits, easily defeated a challenge for that congressional seat, which was the seat vacated by Kay Granger. So, those also, pretty big and important races.
We should mention that Jarvis Johnson won the Democratic nomination for SD15, John Whitmire's former seat.
Right.
And
that in a seat, that's gone back and forth because of the special election. He technically beat an incumbent.
Right.
Although an incumbent, a very short-term incumbent.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yes.
and then, obviously a very, likely to be going to be a Democratic seat. So what else? What else do we want to say about this? I guess the last thing I would ask you what you think, and you're often kind of skeptical about this, but I
like
if
this.
if we look at I think in a good way. If we look at the kind of rough endorsement score, and some of this probably doesn't reflect a couple of the last minute, but roughly speaking, Trump was about 7 for 9 in his endorsements. Abbott in the range of like 38 for 48, Patrick 24 for 33, Paxton 29 for 59.
I had 52. I had 52, but I don't know. I just want to say
that might be okay. That might
29 for 52 or 59. But I think it's 52.
Okay. That could be a typo in my notes. I wouldn't.
It could be me,
surprised by that.
so just saying it out loud. Just so
or
one
it
of
could
us,
be whoever I stole it from got it wrong.
or it's the average.
But the sort of what I'm looking at is kind of the proportion here
right.
mostly. But the question is, as we talk about the Gonzalez race and what that looked like in CD 23, and we kick all this around, and I kind of started with the halfway jokey intro with Trump on trial, but the intersection of national and state politics in the Republican Party continues to be kind of fascinating to me in this as I kind of sort it out.
Yeah.
Because we've talked about that a lot. Obviously, when we asked in our February poll what endorsements mattered most in the Republican legislative primaries. So we lined it out, and that doesn't guarantee that our respondents absolutely answer the question we've asked them.
Or behaved exactly as they described.
But we asked them whose endorsement mattered most. Trump was far and away the most important.
Yeah, by far.
Now, look, there's all kinds of explanations for that are not necessarily about that should caution us from concluding, when a voter walks into a primary election booth, they're going, wait, before I vote, I've got to go through and figure out who Donald Trump endorsed or not.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it speaks to the degree to which, but I think if you look at that, the Trump piece, you look at this discussion we just had about, dissidents becoming, what were once dissidents now becoming, a very powerful, center of influence in the party.
Yeah.
And you think about the alignment of Trump, the way that Trump obviously completely opportunistically and with the advice of
tons of data and people.
And people in Texas that he calls and checks with and says, hey, what's going on? Or that call him and say, hey, here's a good race for you to get in. Your guy's probably going to win, but you'll get credit for this.
Yeah.
How that is all meshing to me is unclear.
Yeah.
But, I don't think you can talk about what's going on inside the Republican Party in Texas without at least considering how it aligns with what has been happening nationally. And vice versa. And as we said, a million times during Trump's rise, the degree to which, a lot of, what became known as being Trumpism or MAGAism, was growing pretty healthily in Texas before Trump rode down that escalator.
Yeah. Just sort of listening to you and thinking about, my reaction to what you're saying. What immediately comes to my mind is, we used to talk about purity tests and everything, but even more so than purity, it's almost like the role that fealty now plays.
I think that's right.
And Trump, was obviously and has continued to be a huge fealty guy, right? You're with him or you're against him. If you're against him, you're basically dead.
Right.
It's pretty hard to come back from. And, that's been true sort of, assuming that and this kind of goes, in some ways this dovetails really well with what you're saying about this sort of thing we're writing a lot about the Tea Party back in the day. And it's still about the sort of tacit support. You'd have people who wouldn't describe themselves as Tea Party supporters, but basically we're pretty okay with the influence, if not encouraging of it. And what I said before is true. We might see, most Republicans would like to see less abortion. But there's a small share of Republicans who'd like to see no abortion under any circumstance at all. And they really drive this discussion. And in some ways, as long as, everybody's kind of, rowing the boat in the same direction, it's not really about, what the policy outcomes or whatever. It's just much more now about, well, who's in and who's out. It's sort of like you think about, Donald Trump and fealty. You think about, again, in the U.S. House, the ability to give basically essentially any member in the Republican Party the ability to try to depose the speaker there, basically for whatever they see is essentially a lack of fealty to whatever issue is they think is the most important. And now you're seeing that in Texas too, right? We've talked about this repeatedly. It'll be quick, but you have a legislature that has passed, incredibly conservative agendas the last two sessions and probably, was successful on 99% or 98% or 97% of the major agenda items of the leadership in the state. And yet, and I would say Paxton has a role in this, but again, that in and of itself is could be a fealty frame too. But not coming through on this one thing means, well, you're not with me, so you're out. And that was one of the funny things I think about the Patrick tweet this morning was saying, well, these 15 incumbents are gone and it's Dave Phelan's fault. It's like, well, there's also the governor who spent millions of dollars against them. And, you were out there tweeting against these people.
Yeah,
and it's silly, I know, but this is the whole.
Well, it's silly, but look, people believe it.
Yeah, right.
Again, this is, it's interesting. I was going to say this is completely impressionistic based on things I heard from people on the ground in some of these districts, but we actually do have data on this that I just talked about in terms of whose endorsement was important. I've talked to a few people that did canvassing that have mentioned to me that when they were just talking to people, and all of the people I talked to were canvassing for incumbents.
Yeah.
But that when they tried to sort of match, hey, well, that he did X, Y, and Z, people go, well, I'll make it think about it, but ultimately, Trump has endorsed the other guy.
Yeah.
And so, that's good enough for me. Huh. And I think that, sorting out this, it does make me think back to the three questions we did about in the February poll about the attention voters pay to endorsements, to policies, and to ideology.
Yeah.
And how all that is kind of in there in the mix. And what you've got are political entrepreneurs, I think, right now, and successful politicians are political entrepreneurs, figuring out, how to align themselves. I'm kind of envisioning it's like a three-body problem, right? Or, you're in there between these three fields of interest. How do you define yourself? As you've been saying, who's the most pure conservative?
Right.
What is it to be a Republican? What do, the opinion leaders, the most important signal senders in my party think? And how all of the actors are navigating that.
Yeah.
Right. And, as you were talking about Trump and we were talking about people responding to this and this whole trajectory of the Tea Party, I'm thinking of people like Steve Bannon.
Yeah.
Right. The former Trump aide and Trump ally, ultimately pardoned by Trump after being convicted. for fraud, I believe. One of the things about Trump and MAGA in relation to what's going on and has been going on for a long time on the ground in Texas is that you have these huge personages in this media environment that provide opportunities for people. And they see it and they make, and again, the good political entrepreneurs, they gamble, but they make judgments about how this helps them and what, how this alignment, what the cost benefit analysis is. And I think Trump has, really changed the cost benefit analysis in the way that has helped what we were, those formerly known as dissidents.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's interesting, in some ways, he's like skewed the market dramatically. And you see this both in terms of fundraising, right? Like, and people talk about this a lot about, sort of Trump sort of hoovering up of Republican dollars, but he's also, he hoovers up attention, right? I mean, when you think about like who are the opinion leaders in the Republican Party, there were more potential names you might have listed before this last presidential primary campaign in which he essentially, I would say significantly hurt the brands of most of them, right? Yeah. Which is sort of the cost of tangling with Trump.
Yeah, ask Jeb Bush.
Yeah, and that's the thing. But that's the thing. I mean, all these guys, all these people that have been sort of his sort of, the counterpoint have essentially, evaporated into the atmosphere in a lot of cases. And so there are fewer, sort of clear counterweights. I mean, the biggest stories I think you almost see sort of if you follow politics real close like us and people who listen to this, I mean, the biggest, quote unquote stories in some ways are like, well, how did Mike McCall get Johnson to like actually like move Ukraine funding? And it's because someone like Mike McCall, is just such an odd figure almost in terms of like in terms of the relative weight of the factions within the Republican Party now. And it's just so shifted into sort of the Trump MAGA direction.
Right.
That's right. What do you need besides a Trump endorsement?
Right. Well, and I think, the answer to that that's interesting to me, as I'm kind of expressing imperfectly here, I think, is a degree to which that just injects energy into some areas of the base. And there are people around it, and that are able to recognize that.
Yeah.
And have the political dexterity, flexibility, if you want, lack of principle.
Or lack of record sometimes.
Lack of record or lack of ideological,
mooring,
or are so ideologically moored. I mean, look, there are people in Texas that have been waiting decades for a Trump.
Yeah,
and so I don't want to like downplay that. And something I left out of that original formulation is also among those people are people with a lot of money.
Yeah,
who have been spending some of that money, but clearly there are some people now that see an opportunity and they're jumping on it.
That's one of my other sort of takeaways from this is, I was looking at the campaign finance numbers yesterday, just kind of seeing where people ended up. And, and if you just looked at the campaign finance numbers yesterday, and if you were the sort of person who would say, well, all that matters is money, right? Well, you'd turn out that it wasn't, you'd be wrong in this case, right? Most of these incumbents, who lost raised tons of money. Justin Hollers raised $1.4 million, spent almost twice as much as Katrina Pearson of their own money. Now, there's other money coming in.
Right.
I want to be clear about that. But it's not like Texas's campaign finance laws are so strict that like this is, the people are being limited. Kemple spent $1.7 million to $433,000 for Schoolcraft. If you were just looking at this, you'd say, Frederick Fraser had $626,000 to $90,000. I mean, there were some pretty big disparities here. So one way to say, so one takeaway is, the money is part of the equation. It's not the whole part. But the other thing I was thinking was, if I were let's just say a West Texas oil billionaire and I was trying to make political investments, these are pretty good investments. I mean, ultimately, because to your point, because this energy is out there, and because
that's kind of what I meant.
Because it's reinforcing. You got to say you've got Donald Trump, you've got Greg Abbott, you've got Ken Paxton, and now if I just throw in half as much money as this very well-heeled incumbent is going to raise, we probably have a pretty good chance to get 55% of the vote. And you know what? You'd be right.
Good investment, and that's the kind of pitch that a lot of people are out there making to these investors, or they're seen on their own, and some of them are, just ready to get involved. So what are we looking forward to? For one thing, I'm looking forward to not having to track this for a while.
Yeah, there's that.
I would say I'm pretty happy about that. And, we're going to now, I think what will be interesting now is to see what the next phase looks like as we move into the general election. Mm-hmm. And we wind up seeing, a nominal but, meaningful coming together, quote unquote, among Republicans. In other words, a bunch of this will remain now. People will be trying to mute all this.
Acrimony.
For the
Dissent.
next, where are we? End of May, for about the next, 5.5 months. Mm-hmm. And then we'll have the election. And then we will have a speaker's race. And then we'll have a very contentious session. And for those of you, and that's the, I mean, I don't think, it's hard for me to imagine, no matter who is elected speaker, unless, the Dan Patrick forces just, pull off some kind of coup by getting a much more, Patrick-friendly speaker elected. And I think that's kind of hard to imagine. Now, there's a matter of degree there.
So the matter of degree.
There's a matter of degree in which, it
wouldn't be hard to find someone who had a better
relationship. Some will make the argument that, why do we have to be so dug into this ancient House, Senate? If we all got along, we could really run the place without friction and have fewer special sessions. Now, I think the past has shown just how hard that is to achieve.
Yeah.
But I think what the mood and nature and the orientation of the House is towards the governor and the Senate by the time January rolls around is going to be, is kind of the most important question at the intersection of institutions and politics.
Yeah, I think there's a widespread. It seems to be, from my impressionistic assessment, a relatively widespread assessment in the body that Speaker Phelan did not do a great job handling the politics of last session.
Yeah.
Now, I think you can hold that opinion, and then that could lead you to say, what would be great is a speaker who is a better relationship with the lieutenant governor, so we're not messed up in that. But you could also get to a different conclusion, which is to say, actually, we just need someone who handles the politics better.
We need to keep fighting those bastards.
And with better politics.
Unquote.
And with better politics.
Yeah, and that will be, I suspect, that will have to be part of the Phelan pitch behind the scenes is, we've learned.
Yeah.
And we've learned in this way. We've learned, but not how to cooperate, but how to fight.
Right, more effectively.
And sorry about,
Yeah, sorry about your friends.
Sorry about the guys that lost. On that note, thanks, Josh. A uncharacteristically hot take-ish discussion. Hopefully we didn't, I didn't make too many mistakes. I'm sure you didn't make any.
I won't remember them if I did.
I want to, that's the way to go. So thank you for being here. As always, thanks again to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio and the College of Liberal Arts here at the University of Texas at Austin. We made some references, some polling data. You can find some of the things we referenced today, including things like job approval ratings for all of the leaders we've talked about, which is kind of interesting context to look at this, if not definitely material to the outcomes. All of that data and more at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. So most of all, thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.